The golden throne did not fail, but the man within it simply ceased to wait. For 10,000 years. The psychic pressure behind the eternity gate felt like a held breath that could shatter a star system, a silent scream of agony, and will that anchored every soul in the Imperium to a singular, rotting point of hope. Then, the vibration changed. It was not the sound of a machine breaking, but the rhythmic, tectonic grinding of a god rising from a tomb of his own design. My ears bled from the sudden silence of the Astronomican's roar, replaced by a low-frequency thrum that vibrated the very marrow in my bones. We prayed for salvation, for a light to scar the warp and mend the fractured galaxy. But as the heat of his awakening began to melt the silver seals of the inner sanctum, we realized our error. The return of the Master of Mankind is not a rescue. It is a reckoning that will strip the flesh from our history. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The transition did not occur with a choir of angels or a sudden thinning of the veil, but through the violent physical rejection of 10,000 years of stagnation. I stood upon the observation platform of the hegemon, a place where the air always tastes of ancient copper and the ozone of a million humming capacitors, and I watched the logic of the Imperium dissolve in a matter of heartbeats. For millennia, we have functioned on the assumption that the throne was a life support mechanism, a static relic that demanded a tithe of souls to keep a guttering candle burning against the infinite dark. When that candle suddenly flared into a supernova, the sheer physical backlash was enough to liquefy the brains of half the choir in the Forbidden Fortress. I remember the smell first. It was not the holy incense of the Ecclesiarchy, but the scent of scorched ozone and the dry, suffocating heat of a desert that has not seen rain since the birth of the stars. The great cooling fans of the palace, machines the size of cathedral spires, began to scream as they were pushed beyond their tolerances by a heat source that defied the laws of thermodynamics. It was a heat of the spirit, a thermal bloom of pure, unfiltered will that began to radiate from the throne room, melting the frost that had coated the lower vents for centuries. I watched a custodian guard, a being of gold and transhuman stoicism, drop his guardian spear as his helmet began to vent steam. He did not scream, for they are beyond such things. But he fell to one knee as the psychic shriek of the awakening shook the foundations of the tectonic plates beneath us. We had spent an eternity preparing for the Emperor's death, building a million protocols for the final darkness. But we had never truly prepared for his recovery. The bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra is a machine built on the foundation of a silent god. A speaking, acting god is a gear that shatters the entire mechanism. Every script, every holy decree, every tithe, count and sector, law was predicated on the interpretation of a distant, dreaming will. Now, the dream was over. The Vox channels were a cacophony of panicked reports from the navigational guilds, claiming that the Astronomican had stopped being a beacon and had become a weapon. Ships in the near void were not being guided. They were being incinerated by a light that was too bright to see and too heavy to bear. In the lower spires, the panic was more visceral, a raw, animal terror that spread through the hive, masses like a viral infection. They had been told for 100 centuries that his return would be the end of all suffering. A golden age returned to the stars. They expected a grandfather's embrace, but they were receiving a conqueror's wrath. The sheer pressure of his consciousness pressing against the thin reality of terror caused the very stone of the palace to weep a salty, crystalline fluid. I saw high-ranking scribes, men who had spent their entire lives calculating the grain, teethers of segmentum obscurus, tearing at their robes and weeping as they realized their entire existence was a lie of necessity. The Emperor is not a creature of mercy. He is a creature of cold, terrifyingly efficient survival. As his mind expanded back into the material realm, the first thing he did was not to bless us, but to begin the process of pruning the dead wood from his empire. The logistics of the palace began to fail within the first hour. The cogitators, ancient and temperamental, could not process the influx of data screaming from the throne's sensors. The life support systems were being diverted to power the physical restoration of a body that was more scar tissue and psychic residue than meat. We felt the oxygen levels drop in the tertiary corridors as the palace itself breathed in, drawing every scrap of energy into the central core. I walked through the Hall of Victories, where the banners of 1,000 crusades hung in the stale air, and watched as they spontaneously ignited. The psychic friction was so intense that the past was literally burning away. There was no joy in this moment, only a profound sense of looming judgment. I saw an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus standing by a viewing port, his face a mask of absolute horror as he looked out at the Terran sky. The clouds were turning a deep, bruised purple, shot through with veins of gold lightning that didn't strike the ground, but seemed to reach upward, clawing at the stars. He turned to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and whispered that the Emperor was not looking at terror. He was looking through it, staring into the warp with a gaze that would draw the eyes of every Neverborn in the abyss. We were no longer the subjects of a protective deity. We were the collateral damage of a titan waking up in a crowded room. The sheer scale of the palace began to work against us. Elevators failed, trapping thousands in the dark. Vox emitters began to howl with a frequency that caused permanent deafness, a psychic feedback loop of the Emperor's first conscious thoughts. It wasn't speech, it was a series of directives, cold and mathematical, slamming into the minds of any psyker within 100 miles. Rebuild, purge, consolidate. There were no words for love, no words for the sacrifice of the billions who had died in his name. There was only the mission. I realized then that the Imperium we had built, with its layers of ritual, its stagnant tradition, and its worship of the decaying form, was an affront to the man who now sat within that gold. We had spent 10,000 years turning his vision into a tomb, and he was about to tear it down with us inside. By the second hour, the atmospheric scrubbers in the hegemon had given out entirely, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched parchment and ancient, recycled dust. I moved toward the inner gates, driven by a morbid, suicidal curiosity. I passed rows of tech, priests who had fallen into a state of catatonic shock, their bionic implants sparking as they failed to interface with the sudden surge of machine, spirit activity. The palace was coming alive, but it was a mechanical resurrection that disregarded the fragile humans who tended it. Doors slammed shut, sealing off entire sectors to preserve the sanctity of the inner sanctum's pressure. I heard the screams of those caught in the closing bulkheads, but they were drowned out by the rhythmic thud of the palace's heart, the massive, subterranean generators that had been silent for eras, now roaring into a life that threatened to shake the spires from the crust of the earth. I found myself in a corridor lined with the statues of forgotten heroes, their stone faces cracked by the vibrations. The floor beneath me was hot, the heat coming from the conduits that ran miles deep, carrying the power of the throne. It felt as though the earth itself was being converted into a battery. I encountered a group of Sisters of Silence, their presence usually a cold vacuum in the warp, but even they looked strained. Their null fields were being compressed by the sheer weight of the Emperor's presence. One of them looked at me, her eyes conveying a message of absolute finality. There was no victory here, only the start of a more terrible war. The Emperor's return meant the end of the age of Imperium and the start of something far more demanding. He would not accept the rot. He would not accept the slow decay we had learned to call life. He would demand the impossible, and he would burn the galaxy to ash to achieve it. The sky over Terra had changed from the bruised purple to a blinding, sterile white. It was the light of the Astronomican, but no longer focused through the choir. It was radiating directly from the throne. It was a light that didn't cast shadows, a light that seemed to peel away the layers of the soul until only the raw, ugly truth remained. I saw men and women on the streets below, visible through the high-altitude viewing panes, throwing themselves to the ground, but they were not praying. They were clutching their heads as the psychic weight of a god's return crushed their sanity. The madness of the warp is chaotic, but the madness of the Emperor is orderly, cold, and relentless. It is the madness of a perfectionist looking at a ruined masterpiece. I reached the threshold of the Sanctum Imperialis, where the air was so thin I had to gasp for every breath. The great golden doors were no longer shut. They were vibrating, a thin line of white light bleeding through the center. The sound was like a million swords being drawn at once. I knew that if I stayed, my mind would be erased, my identity consumed by the proximity to that sun, like intellect. Yet I could not move. I was a witness to the greatest tragedy in human history. The moment our hope became our executioner, the Emperor was not back to lead us, he was back to remake us, and he would start by destroying everything we had become in his absence. The weight of his first step, when it finally came, would not be felt on the floorboards of the throne room, but in the heart of every human being in the galaxy. A sudden, sharp realization that the time of hiding behind the shadows of a dead god was over. The light was here, and it was going to burn us all. The resonance of his first conscious thought was not a message, but a structural failure of the Imperial truth. I stood amidst the ruin of the strategic command level, where the floor was littered with the shattered remains of data slates, and the cooling remains of servitors whose biological components had simply cooked within their shells. The air was a thick, cloying soup of ozone and the copper tang of blood, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. This was the second hour of the new era, and the logistics of the throne world were already entering a terminal cascade. We had always been told that the Emperor's mind was a sun, but we had never considered what happens to those standing too close when that sun begins to expand. Every cogitator bank on terror, from the deepest hive vault to the highest spire sanctum, was being forced to process a data stream of such terrifying complexity that the machine spirits were screaming in a digital agony that mirrored our own. I watched a master of the Vox, a man whose family had served the palace for 6 generations, clawing at his own eyes as the proximity to the Golden Throne's psychic wake burned his optic nerves. He wasn't crying out for help. He was reciting technical specifications for a class of vessel that hadn't been manufactured since the Great Crusade. The Emperor was not speaking to us, he was overwriting us. His return was a hard reboot of a dying system, and we were the legacy software being purged to make room for his revised architecture. I saw a group of scribes huddled in a corner, their hands moving with a frantic, inhuman speed, scrawling binary cant and ancient Terran dialects onto the walls with their own fingernails. They were no longer individuals, they were conduits for a mind that considered a billion lives a minor variable in a much larger equation. The physical reality of the palace began to buckle under the strain of the Emperor's re-embodiment. In the Great Hall of Justice, the massive basalt pillars, each 100 meters thick, began to develop hairline fractures that glowed with a faint, nose-eating violet light. It was the warp, or rather, the Emperor's iron-fisted control over it, pressing back against the materium with such force that the laws of physics were starting to fray at the edges. I saw gravity fail in the western corridors, sending thousands of panicked pilgrims drifting into the vaulted ceilings, where they were crushed by the sudden restoration of triple G pressure. There was no malice in these deaths, only a profound, divine indifference. To a being who views the galaxy across a span of 10 millennia, the accidental crushing of a few thousand souls is no more significant than a man stepping on an ant while looking at the stars. The High Lords of Terror, those masters of the galaxy who had ruled in his name, were nowhere to be found. Rumors filtered through the Vox, haze that some had fled to their private bunkers, while others had been found in their chambers, their brains turned to ash by the first psychic tremor. The power vacuum was being filled by the silence of the custodes, who moved through the chaos with a renewed, terrifying purpose. They were no longer the guardians of a relic, they were the heralds of a king. I saw a squad of them clearing a path through a crowd of screaming citizens. They didn't use their weapons, they simply walked forward, and the sheer presence of their transhuman forms, radiating a fraction of the Emperor's restored majesty, caused men to collapse into seizures or flee until their hearts burst. In the lower hives, the situation was even more dire. The atmospheric processes, already ancient and failing, had been overwhelmed by the sudden atmospheric shift. The air became a toxic brew of heavy metals and sulfur, and the hive dwellers began to die in heaps, their lungs unable to process the divine atmosphere. Those who survived were changed. I heard reports of entire sub-sectors falling into a collective trance, their voices joining in a rhythmic, low-frequency chant that could be heard through the ventilation shafts. It was a song of war, an ancient Terran hymn that had not been sung since the walls of the palace first rose. The Emperor was reclaiming his people, but he was doing so by stripping away their individuality, turning the teeming billions of terror into a singular, blunt instrument of his will. I found myself in the Librarium Magnificus, a space that should have been silent, but instead sounded like a battlefield. The shelves, containing the recorded history of 10,000 years of Imperial rule, were spontaneously combusting. The Emperor was not just returning, he was editing. The vast stores of religious dogma, the hagiographies of the saints, the convoluted legal codes of the Adeptus Arbits, all of it was being scorched from existence. I watched as a tome of the Ecclesiarchy's most sacred laws turned to grey ash in my hands, the letters literally fleeing from the parchment as if terrified by the light. The faith that had sustained the Imperium was a lie born of his absence, and he was burning the evidence of our heresy. The light from the Astronomican had now pierced through the very crust of the planet. From the observation decks, I could see beams of pure, white energy erupting from the ground, lancing into the void. It was as if the planet itself were becoming a weapon, a focusing lens for a mind that was already reaching out to the far corners of the segmentums. But this was not a beacon of hope for the lost ships of the merchant fleets. I saw the casualty reports coming in from the orbital docks. Any ship that was not shielded with the most advanced Geller technology was being vaporized. The light was too pure. It was a psychic flame that sought out every impurity, every taint of the warp, and every fragment of human weakness, and it consumed them. Thousands of ships, carrying the lifeblood of the Imperium's trade, were turned into glowing husks in a matter of seconds. I encountered an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos in the shadow of a leaking plasma conduit. His metallic limbs were twitching rhythmically, and his vox grill was emitting a high-pitched whine. He told me, in a voice that was more machine than man, that the Emperor had taken control of the noosphere. The machine, spirits of terror, were no longer responding to the rituals of the priesthood. They were being slaved to a central command, a singular consciousness that was optimizing every power grid and every factory for a total mobilization of resources. The Magos was weeping oil. His god had returned, but it was a god that had no need for his prayers, only his processing power. The Mechanicus was being absorbed, its secrets stripped away and its autonomy ended. The dread was no longer a sharp, sudden thing, but a heavy, constant pressure that seemed to slow time itself. I watched a group of sisters of battle, women of unshakable faith, standing in the middle of a burning plaza. They were staring up at the sky, their faces illuminated by the white light. They weren't praying. They were screaming at the sun, their minds unable to reconcile the vengeful, cold reality of their God with the merciful Savior they had been taught to worship. One by one, they turned their weapons on themselves, choosing the silence of death over the betrayal of their reality. The Emperor did not notice. His gaze was fixed on the Great Rift, the massive wound in the galaxy that he was already preparing to cauterize with the souls of his subjects. As the second hour drew to a close, the palace began to grow quiet. The screaming had not stopped, but it had become a background noise, a part of the new environment. The vibration of the floor had stabilized into a deep, rhythmic thrum that felt like the heartbeat of a titan. I realized that the panic was over because the resistance was gone. We had been broken. The Imperium of man, as we knew it, had ended the moment he opened his eyes. We were no longer a civilization, we were a resource. I looked out over the burning ruins of the palace outskirts and saw the first of the new formations, legions of citizens being marched into the transport ships by custodes, their movements synchronized, their eyes vacant. They were being sent to the front lines of a war that would make the Horus heresy look like a minor skirmish. The Emperor had not come back to save us from the dark. He had come back to lead us into a deeper, more terrible conflict, one where our survival was not the goal, but a byproduct of his victory. The weight of this realization was more than my mind could bear. I felt the first cracks in my own sanity, the white light of the throne beginning to seep into my thoughts, bleaching away my memories and my fears. I was being integrated. We were all being integrated. The God was back, and he was hungry for everything we were. The mobilization did not begin with a call to arms, but with a total seizure of the human spirit that turned the population of holy terror into a singular, twitching limb of a cosmic organism. By the 6th hour of the awakening, the concept of the individual had been discarded by the palace's central processing cores as an inefficiency that could no longer be tolerated. I found myself drifting through the great processional of the Lion, a thoroughfare once reserved for the most decadent of triumphs, now transformed into a conveyor belt of biological material. The air was no longer breathable in the traditional sense. It was a pressurized mist of recycled moisture, chemical stimulants, and the powdered remains of pulverized masonry. My lungs burned with every inhalation, a constant reminder that the environment of the throne world was being terraformed from within to suit the requirements of a god who had forgotten the fragility of flesh. I witnessed the first wave of the draft, though to call it a draft is to imply a choice or a legal process. It was a harvesting. Entire blocks were being purged by the local enforcers, who themselves moved with a jerky, rhythmic precision that suggested their neural implants had been slaved to a higher frequency. Men, women, and children were being herded toward the star ports, not in a state of panic, but in a terrifying, wide-eyed silence. The psychic weight of the Emperor's return had acted as a frontal lobotomy on the masses. They were no longer capable of fear, only of obedience. I saw a mother lose her grip on her child's hand in the crush. She did not turn back, nor did the child cry out. They simply continued their forward march, their eyes fixed on the flickering white light of the orbital lifters, their minds already occupied by the cold, mathematical directives of a crusade that would consume them all. The industrial sectors of the palace, those vast subterranean manufactorums that produce the weapons of the Adeptus Astartes, had accelerated to a suicidal pace. I stood on an observation gantry overlooking the forges of Sol, and watched as the heat levels rose to the point of melting the protective glass. The tech priests were not performing the rites of maintenance. They were pushing the machine, spirits, to the point of terminal burnout. Huge macro turbines, some of which had been spinning since the time of Malcador, were being forced to triple their output. The sound was a continuous shaking roar that vibrated the very teeth in my skull. I saw Magos of the Red Aegis collapse as his cooling vents failed, his metallic body glowing cherry, red before he simply fused into the walkway. His fellows did not stop to assist him. They stepped over his cooling remains to continue the work. The Emperor demanded steel, and the cost in life was a secondary variable that had already been discounted. In the higher spires, the luxury of the nobility had been stripped away with a ruthlessness that would have made a Knight Lord shudder. I saw a group of high-born scions, individuals who had once controlled the trade fleets of entire sub-sectors, being dragged from their gilded bunkers by the Adeptus Custodes. Their finery was torn, their jewels cast aside like trash. They were being stripped of their titles and handed data, slates containing logistics quotas that were physically impossible to meet. One patriarch attempted to protest, citing his ancient lineage and his family's loyalty to the throne. The custodian did not speak. He simply crushed the man's throat with a casual flick of his gauntlet and moved to the next name on his list. The era of the courtier was over. The emperor had no need for diplomats or sycophants. He needed administrators who could squeeze blood from a stone. And he was prepared to replace any who hesitated with a more compliant servitor. The atmosphere of terror had become a literal weapon. The sky was no longer visible through the thick shroud of industrial discharge and psychic fallout. Above the palace, a permanent vortex of golden lightning churned, discharging bolts of energy into the surrounding spires that functioned as lightning rods. This energy was being siphoned into the orbital defense grid, powering ancient weapon systems that had been dormant for 10,000 years. I watched as a beam of pure solar energy lanced out from a hidden silo near the hegemon, striking an asteroid in the high void that had been deemed a navigational hazard. The asteroid wasn't just shattered, it was disintegrated, reduced to an atomic mist. The Emperor was clearing his path, and he was doing so with a power that threatened to crack the very world he stood upon. I retreated into the lower archives, seeking some respite from the sensory assault, but there was no peace to be found. The very walls were weeping. The ancient stone, saturated with 10 millennia of prayer and psychic residue, was reacting to the Emperor's presence by manifesting a crystalline growth that looked like frozen tears. I encountered a group of unbound psyker, scribes who had been brought in to catalogue the new directives. They were chained to their desks, their heads encased in brass sensory deprivation hoods to keep them from being instantly incinerated by the Emperor's unfiltered thoughts. Even so, I saw smoke rising from their hoods as their brains cooked under the pressure. Their quills moved with a violent, scratching sound, recording coordinates for worlds that had long been lost to the Great Rift. The Emperor was looking into the dark, identifying every pocket of resistance, every chaotic stronghold, and every Xenos infestation with the cold precision of a surgeon identifying a tumor. The horror of the situation began to settle into my bones, a cold, leaden weight that no amount of faith could alleviate. We had spent our lives praying for this moment, imagining it as a time of celebration and divine light. But the light of the Emperor is not the light of a sun that warms. It is the light of a forge that melts. He was not looking at us as his children. He was looking at us as a resource that had been allowed to rot, and he was now in the process of burning away the decay to find the iron underneath. I saw an old priest, a man who had spent 80 years preaching the Emperor's mercy, sitting in the middle of a corridor, his eyes vacant and his mouth hanging open. He had seen the Emperor as he truly was, not a god of love, but a god of survival, and the realization had hollowed him out. The logistics of the return were expanding outward from terror at the speed of light. The Astronomican was no longer a steady pulse. It was a rhythmic, pulsing scream that could be felt by every navigator in the segmentum solar. Reports were reaching us of planets being redirected, of entire fleets being commandeered, and of tithes being increased tenfold. The Imperium was being converted into a total war machine, one that would burn through its own people to fuel its engine. I realized that the Emperor did not care if the Imperium survived the next century. He only cared that it destroyed his enemies in the next decade. We were being used as a fire break against the encroaching tide of the warp, a wall of human meat and cold steel meant to buy him the time he needed to enact a plan that we were too small to even perceive. By the end of the first day, the palace had become a tomb of the old world. The rituals, the ceremonies, The ancient traditions of the Adeptus Terra, all of it had been discarded. The silence of the inner sanctum was now a roaring, mechanical furnace of activity. I stood on the balcony of the Tower of Heroes and looked down at the sea of humanity below. They were being loaded into the transports, thousands every minute, to be sent into the meat grinder of the new crusades. There were no cheers, no music, no banners. There was only the rhythmic thud of boots on metal, and the low, frequency hum of the Emperor's will vibrating through the earth. I knew then that I would never see the sun again, nor would anyone on Terra. The sky belonged to the Emperor now, and the earth was merely the foundation for his war engine. We were the fuel, and the fire was just beginning to catch. The silence of the dead was a luxury we no longer possessed by the 40th hour of the Restoration. On the 4th day of the Emperor's physical re-emergence, the conceptual framework of Holy Terra, as a seat of government, as a holy site, as a home, was formally dissolved in favor of a new designation, Logistics Hub Primus. I was moving through the deep conduits of the Administratum, beneath the level of the clouds, where the pressure of the mountain-sized architecture above usually creates a sense of profound stillness. Now, that stillness was replaced by a high-pitched, harmonic resonance that caused the very marrow of my bones to ache. The Emperor's mind was no longer merely a beacon, it had become a global operating system. I saw thousands of high-ranking clerks, men who had spent centuries navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Lex Imperialis, standing perfectly still at their stations, their eyes rolling back in their heads as they received direct, neural patterned updates to the galactic teeth charts. They were no longer reading the data, they were being written by it. The physical cost of this psychic integration was visible in the gutters. The human nervous system was never designed to act as a copper wire for the thoughts of a god. I walked past a row of scribe cells where the occupants had simply short-circuited. Their skin had turned a translucent waxy gray, and their hair had fallen out in clumps, yet their hands continued to move, scratching new shipping manifests into the metal of their desks with broken, bloody fingernails. There was no medical relief coming for them. The hospitallers had been redirected to the orbital docks to prepare the new legions, and the low-level functions of the palace were left to rot in the wake of the Emperor's progress. The air here was cold, a freezing, artificial chill that came from the massive diversion of thermal energy to the throne's primary processors. I could see my breath huffing out in small, ragged clouds, swirling in the dim light of flickering lumen, strips that were being starved of power. The palace was shedding its history like dead skin. In the hall of the sigillite, I watched as ancient, irreplaceable artifacts, the last remnants of a pre-imperial age, were being hauled out by heavy-duty servitors and tossed into industrial incinerators to clear space for more Vox arrays. The Emperor did not care for nostalgia. The past was a weight he was casting aside to gain velocity. I saw a painting of the Great Crusade, a masterpiece that had survived 10,000 years, being torn from the wall and shredded by the treads of a passing munitorum lifter. The colors of the ancient oils smeared across the floor like blood. To the master of mankind, the history we cherished was merely a record of his previous failure, and he was purging the archives with a cold, clinical efficiency. The memory of the saints, the tales of the martyrs, the very foundation of the imperial cult was being systematically erased from the palace's databanks, replaced by the brutal, mathematical logic of the coming counter-offensive. I encountered a group of space marines, survivors of a dozen war zones who had been brought to Terra for refitting. These were men who knew no fear, who had faced the horrors of the warp without flinching. Yet, as they stood in the presence of the palace's new atmosphere, I saw them trembling. It was not the terror of the weak, but the existential dread of a weapon realizing it is obsolete. The Emperor was not looking at them with pride. He was looking at them as a master, craftsman looks at a rusted tool. I overheard a conversation between a captain of the Imperial fists and a custodian. The captain was asking for orders, for a mission, for a chance to prove his loyalty. The custodian didn't even look at him. He simply handed the Astartes a data slate containing a list of sectors that were to be scarred of all life, loyal or otherwise, to create a scorched earth barrier against the hive fleets. The Astartes' face went pale. This was not a war of liberation. It was a war of planetary scale amputation. In the shipyards of Luna, visible through the high magnification viewing arrays of the naval spires, the moon was being dismantled. Huge chunks of the lunar crust were being excavated and hauled into orbit to provide the raw materials for a new class of vessel, the Dread Cutter. These ships were not designed for long-term patrols or for carrying crews in comfort. They were massive, slab-sided hulls of iron and lead, designed to house a single, powerful psychic amplifier and enough munitions to crack a continent. They were being built in the thousands, a fleet of suicide, ships meant to be driven directly into the heart of the Great Rift. The Emperor was not planning a defense. He was planning a lobotomy of the warp, and he was prepared to burn the moon to ash to provide the scalpels. The social fabric of the throne world had completely disintegrated. The concept of the family, the Geld, or the cult had been superseded by the tactical unit. I saw groups of citizens being branded with new serial numbers on their foreheads, their previous identities legally terminated by the stroke of an automated pen. They were being sorted by genetic viability and cognitive endurance. Those who failed the tests were not executed, they were processed. The palace's food vats, which had always been a source of suspicion, were now openly accepting biological surplus to feed the growing army. The smell of the palace had changed from incense and ancient dust to the sterile, cloying scent of a massive, industrial slaughterhouse. There was no mourning for the dead. The dead were simply calories for the survivors. I found my way to the base of the Pillar of Bone, a monument to the defenders of the palace during the first siege. It was being dismantled. The bones of the ancient heroes were being ground down to make phosphorus for the new munitions factories. I saw a priest of the Ecclesiarchy standing at the base of the pillar, his robes tattered, his symbols of office broken. He was laughing, a high, thin sound that cut through the mechanical roar of the palace. He told me that the Emperor had spoken to him, not in words, but in a sudden, overwhelming realization of the truth. The Emperor didn't want their worship, he hated it. The 10,000 years of prayer had been a psychic noise that had only served to irritate his slumber. The priest then knelt and struck his head against the stone until he was still, his blood joining the dust of the ancient heroes. The return was not a blessing for the faithful. It was the ultimate rejection of their faith. The sky over Terra had turned a deep, bruised charcoal color, illuminated from below by the constant, flickering orange of a world-sized forge. The Astronomican's light had moved beyond the visible spectrum, becoming a psychic pressure that felt like a permanent weight on the chest. I could feel the Emperor's thoughts now, even without neural links. It was a cold, rhythmic thrumming expand. Fortify, destroy, repeat. It was the thought process of a machine designed for total dominion. I realized that the Emperor had ceased to be a man in any sense that we could understand. He was a force of nature, a biological black hole that was pulling every scrap of matter and soul in the galaxy toward its center. There was no room for mercy in that mind. For mercy is a luxury of the secure, and the Emperor saw only the total extinction of the species if he did not act with absolute brutality. By the end of the fourth day, I had reached the outer limits of my own endurance. My skin was peeling from the psychic radiation, and my mind was a fractured mess of overlapping directives and erased memories. I looked out from a high catwalk and saw the first of the Dread Cutters igniting their engines. The sky was filled with thousands of points of blue, white light as the fleet began its ascent. They were not leaving to protect the Imperium. They were leaving to sacrifice it. The Emperor was sacrificing the present to save a future that none of us would live to see. We were the fuel for his final gamble, a mountain of corpses upon which he would stand to strike at the dark. I felt a strange sense of peace then, the peace of the condemned. The wait was over, the god was back, and we were already dead. The final consolidation of the human species began not with a grand proclamation, but with the systematic removal of the word mercy from the high Gothic lexicons. By the seventh day of the Emperor's physical presence, the atmosphere of holy terror had been pressurized to the point where the weak simply ceased to breathe, their lungs collapsing under a psychic and physical weight that demanded only the strongest of vessels. I moved through the sanctum's outer transit ribs, where the very gravity was being siphoned to feed the stabilization of the Golden Throne's new role as a galactic engine. The air was a thick, amber, tinted haze of incense, pulverized bone, dust, and the metallic tang of a world that was being stripped of its soul to power its sword. I felt my heart rhythm slaving itself to the deep, tectonic pulse of the palace, a heartbeat that was no longer human, but a mechanical, rhythmic thud that echoed the march of 1,000,000,000,000 boots across the segmentums. I stood upon the precipice of the eternity wall and looked out at a world I no longer recognized. Terra was no longer a hive world. It was a fortress, foundry of such scale that the mountains had been ground down to provide the aggregate for new, windowless bastions. The Emperor's return had signaled the end of the Age of Faith and the beginning of the Age of Iron. I saw the great rift, that jagged wound in the sky, pulsing with a sickly violet light, but it seemed smaller now. Or perhaps it was just that the white light of the Astronomican was so blindingly intense that the warp itself was being pushed back into the shadows. This was not a cleansing, it was a conquest. The light did not bring peace, it brought a clarity so sharp it cut the mind to pieces. I watched as a fleet of Blackstone, derivative ships, captured and repurposed by the Emperor's new edicts, tore through the atmosphere, their wakes leaving scars of absolute silence in the screaming sky. The high command of the Imperium had been replaced by a singular, focused will. The High Lords were gone, their halls converted into processing centers where the genetic data of entire populations was being sorted and refined. The Emperor was looking for something specific in the human genome, a fragment of potential that he had been waiting 10 millennia to cultivate. I saw the results of this search in the Ascension pens, massive, stadium-sized enclosures where millions of citizens were being subjected to unfiltered psychic radiation. Those who did not dissolve into screaming piles of protoplasm were taken away by the custodes, their bodies and minds remade into something that was no longer quite human. These were to be his new pioneers, a breed of men who could walk the path of the webway without fear, a dream he had deferred but never abandoned. The cost in lives to find a single viable candidate was a number that would have bankrupted the morality of any other ruler. But to the master of mankind, it was a necessary expenditure in a war for survival. The Ecclesiarchy had been dismantled with a violence that was almost surgical. I walked through the ruins of the temple of the Savior Emperor and saw the golden icons being melted down in portable furnaces to provide the conductive plating for new psychic relays. The priests who had resisted were not executed as martyrs, they were simply ignored, left to starve in the shadows of their crumbling cathedrals as the world moved on without them. Their prayers were nothing more than static in the Emperor's new frequency. I saw an arch-cardinal clutching a fragment of a holy relic. Weeping as a group of tech, priests installed a thermal, coupling directly through the altar he had spent his life protecting. The God he worshipped had returned, and the first thing that God had done was to declare the worship a heresy of ignorance. There was no room for the soul in the new blueprint of the Imperium. There was only the will and the work. The logistical expansion was now moving at speeds that defied the warp itself. The Emperor was using the light of the Astronomican as a physical bridge, a highway of pure thought that allowed his fleets to bypass the traditional dangers of the Imperium. But this bridge was fueled by a tithe of souls that had increased by an order of magnitude. I saw the black ships arriving in a constant stream, no longer delivering their cargo to the choir chambers, but directly into the heart of the palace's new energy cores. The psychic scream of their consumption was a permanent feature of the background noise, a high-pitched, shimmering vibration that made the air itself seem to bleed. We were no longer feeding a guttering flame. We were stoking a furnace that intended to consume the galaxy to keep itself burning. In the lower depths, where the forgotten and the wretched had once hid, there was no longer any escape. The Emperor's gaze was total. The shadows had been banished by a light that shone through the very rock of the planet. I saw the underhive gangs, men who had known only violence and darkness, being organized into labor, battalions with a terrifying, hive mind efficiency. Their squabbles were over. Their lives were now property of the state, to be spent in the construction of the great work. I watched a group of them welding a massive, Gothic industrial heat sink into a tectonic plate. Their hands blistered and their eyes sightless from the glare. Yet they worked with a synchronization that suggested their very nervous systems had been slave to the task. There was no rebellion, for there was no longer any I to rebel. The Emperor had not come to save the Imperium, he had come to finish it. The structure we had built was a cocoon, a rotting, protective shell that had served its purpose. Now, the entity within was breaking out, and the shell was being discarded. I realized that the return was not a homecoming, but a metamorphosis. The human race was being forced into its next stage of evolution, a transition that would kill the vast majority of the species and leave the survivors as something cold, hard, and utterly alien to the ancestors who had birthed them. I felt a profound sense of grief for the humanity we were losing, for the art, the music, the messy, beautiful chaos of a life lived in ignorance. All of it was being sacrificed on the altar of a cold, golden perfection. As the seventh day drew to a close, the palace began to vibrate with a new, terrifying intensity. The light of the Astronomican shifted from white to a deep, resonant gold, and the sky over Terra simply vanished, replaced by a view of the galaxy that was not seen through eyes, but through the mind. I saw the hive fleets, the chaos warbands, the Necron dynasties, all of them laid bare, reduced to tactical symbols on a galactic map of fire. The Emperor was taking his first step into the void, not as a leader, but as a predator of gods. I looked at my own hands and saw them beginning to glow with that same terrible gold. I was being consumed. We were all being consumed. The return was complete. The consequences were eternal. Salvation was a lie. There was only the crusade, and the crusade would never end until the stars themselves went cold.